Fiscal Policy and the Job Guarantee by William Mitchell and Warren Mosler. A Brief History of Pathology. The course of inflation and unemployment in Australia since 1970 is plotted in Figure 1. Mitchell, 2001a, uses an accounting framework to decompose the unemployment increases into demand and supply factors and finds that the 1974 recession was markedly different to those that had occurred in the 1960s and also different to the two major downturns since 1983 and 1991. The rise in unemployment between 1975 and 1978 has never been reversed. Once the economy resumed more normal aggregate relations from 1978, the jobless stock was trapped in this historical episode. The 25-year period of persistently high unemployment had begun, and the policy response since has been inadequate. Since the December 1974 trough, the unemployment unfilled vacancies ratio has averaged 11.1. In Figure 2, the unemployment rate is plotted on the left-hand scale against the sum of employment and vacancies as a percentage of the labor force, as a measure of labor demand on the right-hand scale, inverted. The correspondence between the two series is striking, and a major part of the variation in the unemployment rate appears to be associated with the evolution of demand. Modigliani, 2000, concluded, quote, "Everywhere unemployment has risen because of a large shrinkage in the number of positions needed to satisfy existing demand." End quote. Further, the major shifts in the beverage curve since the 1960s have been driven by cyclical downturns rather than any autonomous supply-side shifts. Mitchell, 2001a, Mitchell and Muskin, 2001. Mitchell, 1987, has previously shown that structural imbalances, supply constraints, can be the result of cyclical variations and can be resolved in part by attenuating the amplitude of the downturns. Further, many studies have shown that the relationship between long-term unemployment and the unemployment rate is very close. Chapman et al., 1992. While Laird, Nickel, and Jackman, 1991, may claim search effectiveness declines, and this contributes to rising unemployment rates, the empirical evidence supports the argument that both are caused by insufficient demand. The policy response, then, is entirely different. To help account for the rise in unemployment in Australia, it is useful to compute the evolution of the GDP gap. For the unemployment rate to remain constant, real GDP growth has to be equal to the sum of labor force and labor productivity growth, other things equal. In the midst of an ongoing debate about labor market deregulation, minimum wages, and taxation reform, the most salient, empirically robust fact that has pervaded the last 2 decades is that the actual GDP growth rate has rarely reached this full employment rate. Footnote 3. The full employment GDP rate is strictly the rate of GDP growth required to keep unemployment from changing. Given that we started from a period of full employment, the two are the same. End footnote. This evolution can be captured by examining the relationship between the labor force and total employment. The relationship is shown for Australia since 1960 in Figure 3. Prior to 1974, GDP growth was sufficient to generate full employment. After that point, GDP gaps persisted, and the evolution of unemployment reflects the history of that deficiency. Mitchell, 2001a, finds that a measure of investment shortfall and the yield curve spread as a measure of monetary policy are the most significant determinants of the evolution of the GDP gap. No supply-side measures were statistically significant. The period of deficient demand since the mid-1970s has corresponded with a regime shift in macroeconomic policy making. The goal of low inflation replaced other policy targets, including low unemployment. The result has been that employment and labor force growth in OECD countries has exhibited the pattern shown in Figure 3. We refer to this period as the Nauru buffer stock era. Footnote 4. Blinder, 1987, concurs, quote, if both hard-headed proponents of efficiency and soft-hearted proponents of equity should prefer low unemployment, why have Western democracies offered up such high unemployment? The answer is both simple and vexatious. Inflation. End quote. End footnote. A major manifestation of the policy change has been sharp cutbacks in public sector employment. Mitchell 2001b shows that while private employment growth, 1.91% per annum, more or less matched the growth rate of the labor force, 1.87% per annum, between 1970 and 1999, public employment growth averaged 0.6% per annum over the same period and was negative throughout the 1990s. The rise in unemployment would not have occurred if public sector employment had matched the labor force growth rate. It is worth noting that in the USA, the private and public sector growth rates matched the labor force growth rate between 1970 and 1999. In the next section, we formalize this pathology in terms of a theory of demand-deficient involuntary unemployment.